The 1921 Immigration Quota Act, Part 1, Chaos at Incoming Ports. So here's Part 1. I'm going to talk about the history of the 1921 Immigration Act, what it says, what the 1921, and we'll also look at the 1924 Act did, immigration backups, there were lots of bottlenecks and logistics, and then the blame game. And then finally we'll end, at least with Part 1, on unintended consequences. Part 2 is going to look in more detail about preferential immigrants, non-immigrants, non-quota immigrants, and then we'll look at a number of case studies of people who were admitted and those who were deported and why they were deported, and in some cases, some indication of how they felt they were treated. This video is a continuation of my interest in immigration to the United States. My last YouTube talk on the subject detailed the early surge of 1921 European shipping before the May 1921 quota bill was signed into law. Delays in processing immigrants at Ellis Island were happening, and incoming steamers were diverted to other ports, mainly Boston, some to Philadelphia. And then there was the disease typhus that actually closed Ellis Island for a short period of time. So here is the title page of that previous YouTube video. So those of you who have information, family lore, that your immigrant came through Ellis Island, New York, and can't find their manifest, the manifest may actually be in Boston and Philadelphia, and there are all the ships that were diverted, even when they were on, traveling. They were diverted by to Boston or to Philadelphia. Okay, let's look a little bit about methodology. Using the subscription service newspapers.com, that's a paid service, and searching for 1921 quota and other keywords, I found many newspaper articles. I also used the free website, very nice website, at the Library of Congress, chronicling historic American newspapers. And I'll show some of these addresses, URLs, in the show notes. The document images mainly came from FamilySearch.org, showing you the URL of that. Registration for the site is required, but it's free. It's free. So let's look at a brief history of the 1921 Act. In 1917, Senator Gardner introduced a bill in Congress limiting the number of immigrants to 200,000 in 1 year. That didn't go anywhere. In 1921, Congressman Johnson submitted a bill to bar all immigrants for 14 months. It was substituted in the Senate by Senator Dillingham's bill. And President Harding signed that bill on May 19, 1921, as the, quote, Emergency Quota Act of 1921. The law was to be in effect until June 30th, 1922, but it was extended twice. I'm not going to actually quote too much from that law, but here's where to read what the full 1921 law actually says, and it's at San Diego State University. The law provided that the maximum number of aliens admitted to the United States in any fiscal years start in July, be limited to 3% of the number of that nationality resident in the United States on the 1910 census. But not all nationalities were covered under this quota law. So here I'm showing you the 1910 census, and you can see in column 12 it asks for the place of birth of this person. So they use this for their baseline data. The quota commissioner stated that the bill will affect Italy, Poland, and Greece far more than other countries. You can see this is a quote, so you look on the bottom left, and it came from the New York Tribune of May 29, 1921. And quote continues, I do not believe that the person, the commissioner whose name was Husband, continues, I do not believe that countries like Sweden and Norway, the United Kingdom, and Spain will even supply the quota of immigrants to which they are entitled. I think that Canada was not covered. They didn't have quotas, neither was Mexico, for instance. Here's a quote from a newspaper in 1922, that the admitted purpose of the law is to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe without interfering with the normal movement from the Northern and Western European countries. Translation, Italians and Jews. So this is actually an act that tried to discriminate against certain groups and tried to encourage others to come to the United States. The law decreed that where a person was born, rather than their nationality or citizenship, would determine the quota class. This created problems for many immigrants and their families, as documented in my second video, where Part 2 is shown. There were exemptions and preference built into the law, which I'll also go into Part 2, but as an overview, there were non-immigrants not charged to the quota, here for business, diplomacy, transit to another country, or tourism. There was a category of non-quota immigrants with particular desirable occupations. There was a category of preferential immigrants within quota groups, usually having relatives already in the United States. Interpretation of these rules and how to implement quotas was left to the Commissioner General of Immigration, W. Husband. Husband left some judgments to the overseas U.S. consuls in terms of, and I should point this out, this was an article before it went into effect. And this would be nice if this actually happened. I doubt that it really was consistently happened. So he says that the clause contained in the new bill, which says that aliens visiting the United States as tourists or temporarily for business or pleasure are accepted from the quota. It will be extremely difficult, he continues, to stipulate from this end, from Washington, D.C.'s end, the numerous purposes and missions which shall entitle an alien to visit this country for a short time. The consuls, the overseas U.S. consuls, are far better qualified to inquire into and ascertain the motives for such journeys. But I found a number of situations where the person seemed to be covered under tourist or a businessman, and then was still deported under an exceeding quota situation. I found some newspaper articles on Emma Erminia Federici, who arrived on the Giuseppe Verdi on April 8, 1922, and it shows she came as a tourist, but was considered over the Italian quota. The newspaper articles indicated immigration officials tried to deport her twice, both times stymied by her appeals. Eventually, she was admitted. I'm going to show you a quick look at her record. So here we have her manifest line is at the top. On the very left, there's an SI. She was sent to special inquiry hearing. And then the bottom, and you can see she says tourist there for her occupation. The bottom three images show her line on the special inquiry list. She was held at Ellis Island during her appeals for over 50 days. 50 days. And you can see she, for second cabin, I guess maybe she expected better service, paid more for her ticket. And the QE there is quota exceeded. But eventually she was landed. The very bottom line shows the number of meals of breakfast, lunch, dinner she had. So what were the impacts of the 1921, and we'll also look at the 1924 laws on immigration numbers and countries. So this is the annual European immigration, 1907 to 1914 in thousands. And here we have about 687 to 850,000 during that period of time. Most immigration coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Most are Italians and Jews. In fact, Italians are the biggest group at this period of time. So here we have 1921, 3% of the 1910 numbers, and now you can see that the percentage in the red of Southern and Eastern Europe are quite a bit reduced, and also now we have about 350,000, so we reduced it substantially. But that didn't satisfy some people in Congress, and so they passed the 1924 law, which gave 2% of the 1890 numbers. And now you can see that the percentage of red and the absolute numbers of people in Southern and Eastern Europe were pretty dried up, and just encouraged Northern and Western Europe. Why 1890? Senator Reed indicated, because he's the one who pushed that in 1921, and he pushed it in 1922, that in 1890 there was a much larger number of aliens here from Central Europe than now, percentage-wise. He stated that they have proven to be better citizens than those who have been coming from Southern Europe during the last 20 years. So here we have, desirable immigrants and undesirable. I guess my group of people were considered undesirable by Senator Reed. And here in 1890, again, you can see they asked for the place of birth. This is from the census sheet. So let's look at some logistics that had to be put in place. In order to put the 1924 law into effect, there were a number of factors that had to be calculated. So the Commissioner Husband indicated that the law, owing to, quote, owing to the creation of new countries in Europe and Asiatic Turkey, subsequent to 1910, and the numerous changes made in the boundaries of existing countries as a result of the World War, the task of allotting quotas, according to Husband, to each country was a difficult one, and it was not completed until June 2nd, the day before the law went into operation. Complicated law, and there's really no trial period. The June 1921 partial months quota was based on a fraction of the fiscal year quota numbers for each country starting in July 1921. Husband said there was danger that more than the quota for June already was on the seas, the June of 1921, and that indeed was the case. Also, it was decided by Husband that no more than 20% of the yearly quota could come in for a given month. Thus, it was possible that by December of a fiscal year, a country's quota for the year could be expended. And I'll show you some problems with that. Ports were permitted to transfer unused quotas, so Husband envisioned that if a port ran out of their quota ration for a country, they could query Washington, which would ask other ports to transfer unused quota numbers to the port in need. Shipping lines were warned about the upcoming quotas, but not the specific numbers until early June of 1921. A lot of them just ignored things. So who was responsible for carrying out this process? Was it the consular office issuing visas that presumably guaranteed a place for the immigrant? Was it the shipping companies relying on the visa? Or was the onus on the immigration officials at the different U.S. ports, which turned out probably that was the situation? Where was the coordination? And it broke down very, very quickly. Remember, this wasn't done with computers. Each port had to communicate with Washington, D.C. to query the rules and find out what the filled quotas for each country was before admitting their immigrants. Since excess quota immigrants at Ellis Island and other U.S. ports had the right to hearings, special inquiry hearings, etc., the large number of them at times would bog down the whole immigration screening program. The U.S. had to get better control over the entities by restrictions, by penalties, and by trying to coordinate the various parties. Although the shipping lines, drag their feet. So on June 3rd, 1921, that's the start of this quota. There was lots of confusion, as you can imagine. This is from June 3rd, 1921, Evening World. That was especially true for Italian immigrants, whose quota numbers were set per month at over 3,000. On June 3rd, 1921, ships from Italy already in port or due to arrive within a few days, a total of 4,381 passengers, much more than the permitted monthly average. So the first day they were exceeded the quota. On June 6, 1921, at Boston, the steamer Canopic arrived with 1,000 Italians, 700 more than that port was allotted. Immigration Commissioner Skeffington said he would first select the older persons and then the women and children who have relatives in the country, unless he receives instructions to the contrary. The others will be sent back to Italy on the same ship on her return voyage on June 17th. This is from a June 7th New York Times newspaper article. Obviously, the steamship company pushed other solutions, including allowing them in as they were in transit when the law went into effect, or have them admitted on the July Italian quota. I went through that ship manifest for the July 1921 Canopic voyage, and except for 3 people, all the stamped lines I saw were admitted. So here is one of the manifest pages. You can see stamped admitted. In fact, it looks like these were all stamped at the same time. It's just too neat. Stamp, 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 admitted, admitted, admitted. But on the left column, it starts off with an SI. And you go down, and you can see it just doesn't make sense that it was done at different times. If you look at line, let's say 25, 26, 27, 28, there's also an SI there, special inquiry, which indicates they probably went to special inquiry. Unfortunately, there are no sheets here. This is in Boston on the SI material. So I don't know exactly what happened there. However, they all appeared to be admitted, except there are 3 people who were deported, and you can see in the upper left, they were stowaways. Perhaps Boston got unused quota spaces from other ports. Perhaps the stated excess numbers were resolved with the next piece of history. So pressure was put on Congress this first month to do something to stem the backlog at Ellis Island and Boston. So on June 26, the New York Herald reported those countries with ships sailing on or before June 10, 1921, with excess June quotas would be charged to the next fiscal year's quotas. Those were Albania, Italy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, Luxembourg, Portugal, and some others. So now we get into the start of the fiscal year. So there's a lot more numbers here that you can play with. Let's look at what happened. So on July 21st, we get this paper article that at present, there is a surplus of only 2 nationalities. The July quota for Greece of 657 already has been filled with an excess of 49, while Palestine has sent 2 more than this quota of 11. Some of these countries had really low numbers, and the country had really low numbers. They were lumped into something like Eastern Asia or something else like that. So what happened to these Greeks? Well, one of them sued the federal government. It went into a court, and the headline here from September 1921 is that the immigrant quota ruling upheld Greek losing plea. Judge Mack decides arriving aliens included in monthly surplus must be deported, cannot remain and wait for the next admission list. So here's a person who came in August, on the August quota, said that you're over the quota limit, was still around because of the court cases until September, said, hey, I'm here in September in Ellis Island, why can't you just admit me? And Judge Mack said, nope, you're going to be deported. In fact, there were 3 on this list here from the steamer. George is the one who sued. So this is George Philippakopoulos from Greece on the steamer Presidente Wilson. They arrived on August 18th, 1921. You can see on the left column they all went to SI, and then they were all deported. George, Andre, and Michelle. Even though they say they're merchants, right? Remember that one of the rules was that people here on business on short periods of time, could be admitted without quotas, but presumably they were deported. So on the top we see Michelle. What happened with her? They deported her on August 26 on the Presidente Wilson. So they deported her on the ship that she had arrived on, and doesn't show here, but they're all quota QE, quota exceeded. However, George actually sued the government, and it seemed to me here that what they initially did was they tried to deport him on the Belvedere on September 1st, 1921. He was returned to Ellis Island on September 2nd. Probably there was some court filings here. And then eventually they deported him on the Argentina on September 27th, 1921. So the idea that, if you exceeded quota, you couldn't just sit there waiting for the next month at Ellis Island. They were going to send you back to your original port. Here, going back to now July 23rd, 1921, here we see that Germany, whose yearly quota is 68,000, has sent but 370 immigrants since the law became into effect on July 1st. England to date has sent only 1/7 of her monthly quota, and France less than 1/5. So if they were hoping that by reducing the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, that it would increase the number of immigrants from the, quote, desirable countries, they were disappointed. On July 28, 1921, it was reported that immigration rules to be more rigidly enforced. Ship lines warned more that quota may not land at Ellis Island. So if you had a ship coming in that had more people than the quota was allowed, they would refuse to land you. And the quotas, and this is a continuation of this article from July 28th, the quotas for Africa, Australia, which was very low, Greece, Yugoslavia, Slovakia, New Zealand, Persia, Syria, Luxembourg, Poland, Palestine, and Turkey have now been filled or exceeded. Vessels bearing immigrants of these nationalities due to arrive before the end of the month will necessitate their waiting outside the 3-mile zone until August 1st. So is it cheaper for the shipping companies to take these people back to the original port or to wait around? And there was obviously a break-even point here. August 9th, 1921, 1,000 immigrants in excess of quota will enter on bond. Commissioner Husband rules aliens now held at Ellis Island will be charged to years totals. So it's quite apparent that it's just a catch-up game, and that every once in a while they had to do something to solve this problem of immigrants at Ellis Island. In this case, they basically bent the rules a little bit. So at the request of Secretary of Labor Davis, an amendment to the immigration law will be introduced in Congress, permitting as many as 1,200 immigrants to enter the United States from any one nation. Now, there's a reason they did this. I don't think it ever passed. This never went into effect. So the article continues. It's pointed out that Australia, New Zealand, and other countries which in recent years have sent 1,000 or 1,200 immigrants, quote, these are desirable people with Central European ancestry of desirable type, whereas now their quotas are below 200 each. So that's the reason why they wanted this 1,200, not 1,200 from Africa or 1,200 from Poland, etc. December 16, 1921. Mr. Husband said that a bill is to be introduced in Congress by Senator Dillingham, which if passed, which I think it might have, would stop the practice of some steamship companies of bringing immigrants of nationalities where the quota has been exceeded. Bill provides that the steamship company bringing immigrants over the quota allowed be fined $100 for each immigrant, and I think it eventually turned out to be $200, and be required to deposit an amount equal to the fare paid by each excess quota immigrant. The immigrant has to be taken back free, and the fare he paid to come over is to be returned to him through the U.S. consuls in Europe on his return, putting pressure on the shipping companies. It was going to cost them money now. So let's look at what happened in Christmas 1921 at Ellis Island. Ellis Island had this tradition of having a Christmas celebration at Ellis Island. I never quite understood that. Anyway, here, December 20th, Ellis Island filled with aliens facing compulsory return. Gloomiest Christmas ever known for those who sought refuge here. Ships also packed. Despairing immigrants are mostly from famine-stricken lands. Thousands must go. Remember, December, the quotas are probably going to be all filled, especially in some of these countries, because of the 20% per month law. And as I indicate, there's something inconsistent in my mind of putting on a celebration for an imprisoned group of aliens, of which many were going to be deported, and some of them didn't celebrate Christmas. Some of them sold all their possessions to get to the United States, only to be turned around by something they did not do themselves. For more on such Ellis Island celebrations, there's a whole website on this history of Christmas at Ellis Island. In any case, what happened was that the secretary decided to release the aliens for Christmas. He did it unilaterally. So here we have release aliens for Christmas. Each was released on his or her own bond, all agreeing to make arrangements for passage back home at the end of a 90-day stay on American soil. December 25th article. Over 1,000 joyous aliens desert Ellis Island. Immigrants given 90-day leave make grand rush for U.S. soil as a result of the Secretary Davis's order. Welfare bodies overtaxed. These are these welfare societies that help people acclimate, transfer them to railroads, etc. But there was just this mass exit, but not everybody was released. So what type of bond was it? Was it a signature bond? Just their signature? What happens after 90 days? Did they get a reprieve? I don't think any of them went back. I found that the head of the Immigration Committee, Representative Albert Johnson, stated on December 24th, 1921, in the Evening Star newspaper that he would introduce a resolution to make permanent the temporary 90-day release. And I looked at these resolutions in 1921. I could not find such a resolution. I don't think any of them any of them came back to Ellis Island. Did released immigrants follow through and go back to Europe, or did they stay? I sampled 109 of those immigrants that I felt were released for Christmas, released on December 23rd and 24th from the steamer Crowland. So Crowland arrived on December 12, 1921. I looked at their special inquiry pages, and there are quite a number of people were still on those pages and released on December 23rd and 24th. There are no statements on that ship manifest lines or on the special inquiry lines of any bond, or that any of them were eventually deported. And I found that 30 of those Christmas released aliens, when applying for a petition for U.S. naturalization years later, used the Crowland for their entry ship into the U.S. So they didn't go back to Europe and then come here and then applied for naturalization. So there's no indication those people who released were actually deported. Let's look at the next year again, another December 1922, where things would get bad. Immigrants this is a quote from December 15, 1922, newspaper article, the immigrants from Italy will not be permitted to enter the United States until after June 30th, 1923. It was announced by immigration officials who said that about 1,500 immigrants who arrived last week had exhausted the yearly quota and exceeded the December quota by 355. November 4th, 1923. 3,000 aliens face deportation as 77 quotas are filled. And these are both yearly and monthly. 1,267 arrivals on the Leviathan alone. 2,000 British may be sent back. No relief in sight, husband declares. Foreign governments and steamship companies blame for conditions. More than 10,000 immigrants are on ships in the harbor, awaiting examination of Ellis Island, the commissioner said. He characterized the influx as one of the worst jams that the department has ever faced. All right. Now, to get it on a personal level, one outcome of this poorly planned, no trials or etc., learn on the fly, poorly planned quota law was that aliens arriving in U.S. ports were often held on ships because officials did not receive from Washington up-to-date quota numbers. So here we have Madame Tamaki Mayura, Japanese girl famous as Madame Butterfly of the Chicago Opera Company, is being detained on the line Vasari today because immigration officials have not been appraised of the correct monthly quota of immigrants from Japan. December 1921. July 1921. When the Swedish-American steamer Drottningholm arrived, 78 of her second-class passengers were detained on board by the immigration authorities for 4 hours. At 4 o'clock, word was received from Washington that the quota of 20,000 for Sweden was very low and that all could land. What didn't they know that before that? Well, this one, after being detained on the steamer Marama 24 hours, Mr. and Mrs. R.J. Higgins, prominent Australians, were released by immigration officials who had been notified by Washington that the Australian quota of immigrants for September was dangerously near the limit. And with 2 vessels arriving the same day from that country, it would be advisable to detain all these immigrants until it could be definitively learned whether or not the new arrivals would exceed the month's allowance. That's from September 1921. So a lot of the problems also led to this, paradoxical thing, the steamer races. Because the yearly quota was divided up into months where as many as 20% of the quota could enter, if you wanted to ensure a good chance you would be accepted, you would aim to be first in line on the first of a given month. That led to the liner races where there could be winners and losers. Steamers who arrived late in the month and over quota decided to stay beyond the 3-mile U.S. limit, waiting for the start of the new month. For example, the Greek ship Megali Hellas, the newspaper headlines said, 8 miles offshore, drinks galore. This was during Prohibition. Cool. Yet they complain. Why would they complain? Well, they're complaining. They want to get ashore. Greece had reached her July quota, but there were 100 Americans trapped on board that ship, as well as 550 Greeks. Although husband said the U.S. citizens could be removed by small boat and brought ashore, the shipping company refused, so they had to wait until the first of the month. It's my understanding of the rules that at midnight of the first of the month, the liners could pick up a required pilot at Ambrose Channel lightship to enter New York Harbor. It's a 12-mile race to the quarantine processing area. The winner should be the first to have their passengers applied to the monthly quota of countries. The losers might find their passengers are now over quota, and they would have to be sent back to Europe. They could not land them. So let's ask, did it work as planned? Did it work as planned? I think this is from husband quote. The countries of Northern and Western Europe, however, have not taken advantage of the quota allotted to them, as during the last fiscal year, only 46% of those who might have come have actually been admitted. On the other hand, 95% of the year's quota of Southern and Eastern Europe and Asiatic Turkey were admitted, and the quotas of practically every country except Russia and Austria were exhausted early in the year. Somewhat less than 4,200 came in excess of the quotas during the last year, and of these about 2,500 were admitted temporarily in the interest of humanity, while only 1,600 were actually rejected as excess quota in the fiscal period. They talk about they were admitted temporarily, but it never seemed that they were, those groups were sent back. They seem to, I'm not quite sure what exactly happened there. The impact on American labor and business, people were saying, hey, if we restrict people from coming in, this would be good for our labor people in the United States. But it was not. So first, an article, November 26, 1922, new law decreases U.S. laborers by about 67,000. First year of immigration restrictions seriously affects manufacturing, felt by farmers too. U.S. is dependent on immigrants. People at Stanford did a study on the effects of immigration in the 1920s on the U.S. economy, and I'm showing you the address of that and what their results are next. So this is there's some general words here, specific words for economists. They indicate that U.S.-born workers in more exposed areas, I think those are areas prone to immigrants seeking jobs, did not benefit from the immigrant losses and even experienced occupational downgrading, including lower wages. Instead, local economies substituted toward other sources of labor and capital. In urban areas, immigrants were replaced with internal migrants and immigrants from quota-free countries such as Mexico and Canada. By contrast, farmers shifted toward capital-intensive agriculture, and the immigrant-intensive mining industry contracted, highlighting the unintended consequences of the border closure. So this was part one. Part two is going to talk more about individuals and their problems they faced, either being deported or having to jump through hoops. This has been another of my YouTube JDW talks. I have talks on genealogy topics, census, resources, Ellis Island, immigration and naturalization. Lots of talks on natural history topics, virtual birding field trips, birding optics, California birds, and things of interest to me, such as novelty zithers and biology songs. So I hope you enjoyed part one. I encourage you to stick around and see Part 2.